Can I take this off, actually?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, hello everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time to come out in what I think is a very, very stressful period for everybody, so I appreciate you kind of showing up and kind of taking an hour out of your schedule to do this and to listen to me speak for the SIPA Speaks talk this semester called Climate Change and Security, Risks, Entry Points and Political Dynamics. I'm Christian, I'm a first year MBA student concentrating in energy and environment and specializing in management. I hope this is not too awkward, me kind of standing up here and you sat down in a bit of a small crowd, but that's perfectly fine. We'll kind of open it up a bit more, I think, for the questions at the end. Before we get going, a brief disclaimer that despite these logos being up here and my former colleagues kind of very kindly giving me some slides and material, nothing I'm going to say represents the opinions of the Federal Foreign Office, of Adelphi, or any of the kind of associated initiatives that I've worked on. Okay. So, firstly, two questions really that might be on your mind. How did I get here, and what gives me the authority to kind of act as if I have a semblance of knowledge on these topics, and what can you kind of expect from this talk? So, before coming to SIPA, I've done my undergrad in politics, international studies and sustainable development at the University of Warwick in the UK, and then from October 2019 to June of 2021, I have worked at Adelphi in the climate security and diplomacy team, first as an intern and then in a permanent role. And I've kind of seen a lot of these things there, obviously, and kind of learned them on the job, and I hope that does kind of give me enough to kind of kickstart a conversation here and give you really what I hope is kind of a one-on-one on climate change and security, kind of political dynamics, but also kind of the policy side of things. I'm going to try and talk for about kind of 40 minutes and then keep time for questions. We'll see how that goes. And I've tried my best also kind of from invitation from OSA to get the personal angle in there, speak a bit on what I have done personally in that role, and also try to get some pictures in, although with the pandemic happening, there isn't as much cool stuff to kind of show you as I would have hoped, because a lot of it obviously happened on a laptop screen, but we'll see. So those are kind of our three questions for today. What's at stake with climate security? What can we do about it? And kind of where do we stand politically? Really briefly, a disclaimer on kind of content here. Obviously, kind of war and conflict are very sensitive topics, and the kind of regions we're covering kind of the world over, and I've really tried to aim for diversity in examples, pictures, and kind of content covered. And I personally think about this in very, very broad terms, right? Climate change impacts and kind of social impacts associated with that will happen the world over, but kind of at different rates and different points in time. And that impacts the examples used here. What I don't want to do, or kind of what I don't want to create an impression of, is that any certain region, any certain people, any certain place really is risky or is a risk, right? Or kind of make any political statement in that vein, right? All of that should be separated kind of from individuals and politics, and it's really just a look at where things stand at the moment, and I do hope you kind of keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay, so first question, right? What's at stake, or as I could have also called this, why bother, right? That was too fast. Okay, so obviously climate change and security as a topic matters just by virtue of climate change being a huge factor in everything that's kind of going to happen from here on in, and has already happened. And the scale and severity of that obviously overlaps with a bunch of security relevant sectors and kind of dynamics out there in the real world, right? It seems kind of foolish or a bit short-sighted to think that climate change can kind of stay isolated in one kind of box while the security and development stuff kind of happens around that and isn't impacted by it. And all of that comes with huge geopolitical dynamics, not only kind of decarbonisation and climate change policy and climate change impacts, but clearly also security and conflict in and of itself. And that's why it's worth looking at, and it's worth doing this now, because if we want kind of proactive policy, if we want something to happen in time and at the right point, then we do need awareness. We do need to think about this now, and we need to know what's happening. But the big challenge in all of that is that climate change and security isn't one organisation, it isn't one silo, it isn't one school of thought, it isn't one level of experience, right? It happens in two realms which don't communicate often, right? Climate change, foreign policy, those aren't typically people that interact on a day-to-day basis. And I very, very clearly recall an anecdote that was shared with me on the European Parliament kind of Foreign Affairs Committee being asked to consider having a debate on climate change, and that very quickly kind of being shot down in terms of this is not our realm, there is a committee on environmental policy, they should do that, we do foreign policy, we do something completely different, this isn't within our realm, and I think that translates also to this isn't necessarily within our kind of realm of expertise and kind of what we're confident with politically. You've already seen the next slide, but my kind of headline message here, and I guess this is good, is that climate change does not directly lead to conflict. Right on one side of the equation, you don't turn the temperature up, and then on the other side, you just automatically, directly, in some sort of deterministic fashion, get more conflict. That is something which I think has been an academic opinion, or kind of a general opinion kind of around the 1990s, 2000, but as research has progressed, it has really kind of gotten data to tell us that is not the case, right? What that doesn't mean is that the two things don't interact. And these are some numbers I put together at Adelphi. It's a very simple overlap of kind of two indices, the end-of-game vulnerability index and the FSI fragile states index. And it is notable that there is a massive overlap just in terms of regions, right? So what this says is that 70% of the most climate vulnerable countries are also kind of in the most fragile quartile of countries. And kind of as we go down, not a lot of places which are very vulnerable to climate change are in that more stable kind of area on that index. Right? That doesn't tell us anything about causality, but what it does tell us is that looking at this on a map, and this is from a paper for USAID from 2018, is that there are huge swaths of the world where kind of fragility and climate exposure will overlap. This isn't a map of risk, it isn't a map of, kind of this is where things will happen, but it is very simply a comparison of where you get both, right? And there are a lot of places where we simply get both, and that might indicate that there's something very real and worthwhile going on. And so climate change impacts do pose real risks to international peace and security, and they already today, right, undermine human security, and they increase the impact of drivers of conflict and fragility. That means leading to new conflict, intensifying conflict, prolonging conflict, or just in those kind of situations in between, really making peace a lot harder to sustain, peace harder to reach. They kind of throw things up in the air when it could be a lot clearer. And all of that, and that is what kind of the bulk of this presentation is going to be on, is that context and conditions, right? Where are we talking about? What is the very specific situation? That matters hugely when we talk about this. Just as much as there isn't a kind of direct causal linkage, there also isn't one kind of template that you can just put on it in place and say, this is what's going to happen, we have the magic bullet. And those open questions, they really exist in the kind of academic research realm. I think the kind of think tank world and political world, they're at a different point, but there's a lot of really worthwhile kind of academic thinking on, how do we measure all of those things, right? How do we talk about, how do we study something which is very limited maybe today, or kind of much more limited today than it will be in the future? How do we attribute climate change when it interacts with these other factors, right? How do we assign relative weight to the political situation and the climate impacts? How can we ever kind of hope to tease two things apart which just don't happen separately in the real world, right? How do you write a study and separate out one impact? That's complicated enough on the kind of physical side of things. When you get this very social political dynamics of conflict in, it's not getting any easier. And then, much as my kind of disclaimer at the beginning already said, you know, there is kind of an ethical element to having a discussion on conflict and security and on climate change, and kind of talking about risk. That's just something to keep in mind for those discussions. Quick kind of graphic here on what we're going to talk about, right? This goes to what I said, to those contextual conditions. Climate change compounds existing risk, and it does that through a number of different pathways, 5 of which kind of really clearly emerge in current research, which I'm going to cover. And all of those different factors, which you have here, right, developmental impacts, they kind of interact with weather and political dynamics and climate more broadly to create the kind of situations where and the first of those, that's the second, the first of those is natural resource competition, right? So while it isn't about kind of resource wars, as I think, you know, there was a lot of thinking on this, there is a dynamic in which climate change increases pressure on natural resources, and that can lead to kind of disputes, instability, and violent conflict. And a good example of that is conflict which keeps kind of flaring up. There's pastoralists on here twice, which is very impressive, between pastoralists and farmers in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. And really what that means is that if you get diminishing water resources in one place, and you're a pastoralist and you have a bunch of cattle that you need to move through different areas just to kind of keep your livestock alive, maintain your livelihood, you may need to shift the routes in which that happens. You may not be able to, because of climate change, maintain kind of migratory patterns which you have used for decades maybe. Suddenly that needs to change. And what that might mean is that suddenly water resources are much more available in an area which is farming. And then when kind of livelihoods come into conflict because of natural resource pressures, that can be a real source of kind of low-level community conflict. And while that isn't a war, it does have very, very real effects on large numbers of people, right? And that often happens in situations where already conflict management is kind of weak or has been weakened for political reasons, where certain groups have been marginalized, kind of politically excluded, and in those situations when people feel they don't have a voice, they feel they can't influence a process through other means, but kind of livelihoods are at risk because of natural resource pressures, that's when kind of conflict risks can be increased. And the second thing on here is kind of transboundary areas and water resources. And there used to be a lot of thinking about what happens in kind of between countries when kind of water resources are shared, and rivers are shared, and aquifers are shared, and is that a risk of kind of real, really big kind of large-scale conflict and potentially war? The data doesn't suggest that, luckily, but what we can see is that diplomatic tensions do arise around those things. In the kind of Blue Nile, that's the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is being built, that has definitely led to tensions between kind of upstream Ethiopia and kind of downstream Egypt, because when you dam a huge river and just less water gets to those kind of downstream areas, that has an impact on people. It has a political impact. There's a kind of political sign here as well about kind of maybe preserving something quite central to the kind of national image of the country, and that has definitely led to diplomatic tensions. All of those kind of at a kind of low simmering level, but this will continue. Water resources will get strained, and there is a question around how we can resolve those tensions. The next one is livelihood insecurity and human mobility. And the thing here is when climate change leads to livelihood loss, a lot of people will need to look for something else to do, right? And unfortunately, quite often in kind of destitute situations, that means looking to livelihood strategies which are either illegal, illicit, maybe just very risk-laden, and just nothing people would have chosen without an outside pressure from climate change coming in. And poppy planting in Afghanistan is certainly an example of this, where climate change and kind of rising temperatures have made other farming much more difficult to sustain at a viable level. but there is a farming activity which you can do on the same land, which brings in resources and which is much more kind of stable in the face of rising temperatures. Again, that isn't deterministic, right? Temperatures don't rise and suddenly people become criminals. I'm already sorry for using that word, right? But it does give you maybe an incentive to consider things that would have been completely out of the question before. And with kind of livelihood loss, people will also move and migrate to find different livelihoods. The majority of that will be internal migration, right? That is a huge kind of narrative around international climate migration, which frankly the data doesn't support at this point in time. Although different studies will kind of point to different things, but the bulk of kind of climate migration will be internal to countries, and that can be a really good adaptation strategy if you need a job, if you need to move somewhere else and kind of just protect your family and yourself, then that is great. But it will challenge host communities, especially in kind of urban areas which are growing really quickly, where you will see more informal settlements, where kind of resource provision is really strained, where infrastructure will struggle, and again that can lead to those low-level tensions, which can break out into something potentially much more kind of dangerous. Okay, at this point, before we move on, any kind of questions, anything clear? Yeah.
What's the example about Lake Chad? I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah. So Lake Chad is a lake between Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad. And I really hope I'm not forgetting another country here. I may. I'm really sorry. And that has been the site of a kind of huge humanitarian tragedy and really prolonged kind of the conflict at very different levels with a bunch of non-state armed opposition groups. So that's kind of ISIS spin-offs and similar terrorist organizations. And there as well, there have been certainly incentives and kind of cases we've seen where people kind of robbed of former livelihood opportunities because water levels in the lake kept changing, they couldn't farm anymore, and then a steady source of income was joining a group with a very large amount of kind of financial reserves who can give you a livelihood, who can give you an incentive to kind of participate in their activity despite you not supporting them, right? But just the barrier is lowered when you need to make ends meet, and then people have joined the Okay, time. The next one is kind of extreme weather and government legitimacy. And the thing here is, extreme weather events, which will increase kind of the world over, they can lead to massive destitution, massive loss of livelihood. And a key determinant in how that will play out is whether the government can formulate and implement quickly enough a kind of adequate response to that. When people feel kind of neglected after a huge disaster, those grievances against governments, kind of dissatisfaction, that can really, really grow. Thailand in 2011, which is on here, really strong monsoon rains, kind of the strongest in 30 years. 2 million people affected at the time, and that really led to and kind of contributed to an already ongoing kind of wave of protests against the government. And a lot of people at the time felt that kind of aid was distributed kind of unfairly, and protests kind of kept rising and continued until there was a military coup in 2014. And again, separating these out is incredibly difficult because I don't, and nobody has for you a kind of alternative history where that flooding didn't happen, right, where those rains didn't happen. But there was a new level of dissatisfaction because people felt like their needs were not being met and the government was too slow to look out for certain people and parts of the population, and that has contributed to already kind of similar tensions. And I put the extreme weather in Europe on here, and kind of a picture from the Ahr region in Germany, just to kind of underline that while that situation didn't lead to kind of any conflict, what it has led to, right, is a massive impact on kind of public budgets. It has diverted resources. It will do that anywhere because, kind of budgets to be prepared for kind of, 100-year events is, low and limited, and having the foresight for that, I think, is only really, really emerging. And certainly in Germany, there were a lot of people who felt like government response was too slow, like there was kind of underserving of deserving communities. And it certainly impacted, right, the election, which kind of happened in the September of this year. And there was a lot of talk about the differing response of kind of politicians, what was appropriate, who showed up, who didn't show up. And those things kind of can really happen everywhere. And the question is, are governments able to kind of respond quickly enough? And if they don't, what will that lead to? I'll go over this one. A bit more quickly, because I think this is something you probably will have heard before. Climate change and food price spikes. That is probably the area where we have the strongest evidence of climate change really heavily impacting farming, and then potentially really leading, or having already led to massive increases in goods that are real necessities for people. And when food prices spike, we can see an increase in protests across really a lot of different regions. The Arab Spring and rising bread prices is definitely something we have very good data on. 27, 28 was also a time when, kind of connected to the financial crisis, also food prices spiked, and kind of social unrest in African cities really, and a number of them, although kind of concentrated in the Sahel, has also increased. I think it was 2020 when there was an onion price increase in India, which is also mixed with political dynamics and caused not kind of huge scale upheaval, but certainly that kind of tension and protests and people going to the streets to demand that the government kind of take action on something which, you know, you need to be able to afford on a day-to-day basis. And kind of future climate change will only make farming much more difficult, and kind of contribute to the insecurity. Last of these risks is unintended policy consequences. And I don't want to say I enjoy this one, but I think it is something that before I started this, I wouldn't really have thought about. But as we respond to climate change and as we respond to conflict, importantly, both of those, right? If responses aren't calibrated well, if we don't keep social dynamics in mind, if we don't keep climate change in mind, it is really, really easy to do it wrong and to contribute to situations which you did not want. And designing good policy and good governance is really, really important for all of those risks, but this one in particular. That is a picture from France. The Yellow Vest protests there, I'm sure you've all heard of them. That was about a kind of increase in gasoline prices effectively, and a lot of people kind of took to the street. That mixed with a bunch of different anti-government sentiment and really widespread protests in the country. The Lake Chad example on here is a fascinating story. So like I said, there was a huge amount of conflict there, and military came in, and what they kind of saw was that, oh, maybe armed groups engaged in red pepper farming more than kind of other parts of the population there. And what the military has done in many cases is destroy red pepper farming to hope to kind of negatively impact groups there and kind of present a show of force. Right? But when that happens in a climate resource constrained environments, and when people already have limited livelihoods, and when you go and kind of destroy something which happens to grow and work there, that is not going to lead to a better situation, right? And if you kind of interfere in your military response with something which is also connected to climate change, we're only going to kind of contribute to situations and dynamics which, you know, will become kind of harder and harder to control. Environmental offenders in the Amazon, a bit different here, but there are massive scales of violence against people in the Amazon who are kind of climate environmental activists, and they're kind of standing up for certain topics and promoting certain policies and hoping to kind of lead to kind of changes in the government response. That also, right, presents a risk of conflict to a great number. Almost done here. Three kind of trends across all of those, you know, really briefly. Governance, I'm sure you've kind of heard across all of those risks, really matters, right? Is the government able to respond to extreme weather? What are the provisions for kind of livelihood alternatives, and are people able to switch to something else when climate change kind of prevents what they've done before? Can they migrate safely, right? Is there conflict resolution mechanisms when kind of natural resource competition leads to that? All of those examples, they tell a story of how climate change interacts with government. We're also really likely, and I have a slide on this, underestimating what climate change will really do, right? Because attribution is really difficult, because we don't have a clear idea of cascading risks. So if you change something in one sector, and if that goes wrong, how will that impact another sector? How will kind of a dip in agricultural commodity kind of affect international trade and finance? And you know, what really happens when we look at cross-border risks, right? Because no place is isolated from any other place anymore. So if you get rising prices in Eastern Europe, we have already seen that, oh, you can get conflict in kind of the MENA region, but that is nowhere near the kind of level of knowledge that we should really hope to kind of have. And as climate change continues and as we get a better idea of kind of tipping points, unfortunately, we may also have a very different picture of what climate change really does to people and to different regions. Those are just to get you thinking. This is a study done on the human climate niche and kind of the future on it. The scenario is RCP 8.5, which is a very, very extreme scenario, so you know, you don't need to take that as a likely event. I think that's, I'm not sure how many degrees warming this translates to, but essentially really unlikely to kind of get to that point. But what I do want to show you is, right, if you get to a certain scale, there are regions of the planet where, you know, habitation will become increasingly difficult. And then what do you do? Because people will still live there and they will want to move, right? When Pacific Islands kind of can't sustain livelihoods anymore for people, and there's no kind of politics in place to kind of, you know, protect people, facilitate migration. What does that mean? All of those are things we don't really have an idea about in terms of security. And this is a paper which was published just a few weeks ago, which I was very surprised by, because I had already kind of forgotten that this has happened, and I wasn't sure of the timeline, and you know, academic publishing timelines are massive. We took a look there at kind of cross-border climate risks for Europe. You can have a look at that paper, it's open access, but the story of it is, in a nutshell, it is really, really difficult to look at cross-border risks when the research isn't there, and when doing all the math and building all the models behind it is something which needs funding, which needs resources, and we are really, for a lot of those kind of in-between risks that don't happen in one place, we are kind of stabbing in the dark still, and that's something to, you know, probably be concerned about. And the story, again, kind of, as I'm sure you've already noticed now, is that all of those risks are systemic, they're interlinked, and kind of drawing lines in the ground is incredibly difficult in the real world, but we might need to, you know, do that for policy. Papers and kind of examples of where is this going. Kind of what I've taken was from the 10 Insights on Climate Impacts on Peace, which is a study we have co-written at Adelphi with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. The methodology for weathering risk, which is one of the leading climate risk assessments at the moment, is, and the second slide is from that project as well, kind of asking the question, how can we get better in climate security research of linking kind of climate science data to the social side of things. And we've tried to kind of build a model there which allows us to take climate impact data and construct a model which can help us better, not predict, I really don't want to use that word, but kind of understand better the kind of conditions under which climate change impact can contribute to kind of conflict and instability, especially. Okay. Looking at time, I'm going to take a sip of water.